Thanks so much for getting started tonight. I want to welcome you here to tonight's lecture, which is sponsored by the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. The Washington Forum is a civic education initiative which aims not just to promote intellectual diversity here at OU, but also to provide a forum where sometimes contentious subjects can be discussed and debated and reasoned and in a reasonable way. And tonight's lecture, like all Washington Forum events, isn't made possible by student fees. Those go to the football team. It is, however, made possible by the generous donations of OU alumni, and staff, and grants from foundations, including, in part tonight, the Charles Koch Foundation. Tonight's speaker is Ben Domenech. He's the publisher of The Federalist, host of the Federalist Radio Hour, and author of The Transom, the daily subscription newsletter for political insiders. He was previously a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute, editor-in-chief of The City, an academic journal on faith and culture, and speechwriter for Health and Human Services Secretary Tommy Thompson, and for U.S. Senator John Cornyn of Texas. He co-founded Red State and co-hosted Coffee and Markets, an award-winning economics podcast. His writing has been published in the Daily Beast, Politico, Commentary, Reason, and GQ, and he appears regularly on MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and CBS's Face the Nation. And if you're watching election night coverage on CBS, you'll see Ben analyzing the results as they come in there. Those who've read Domenech's work will know that he has been, while he's been decidedly skeptical about Donald Trump, he's also tried to understand Trumpism itself. Many on the progressive left see Trump and Trumpism as conservatism and the Republican Party's unclothed real self. Many conservatives, by contrast, reject Trump and Trumpism as aberrations of genuine conservatism, which it takes to be the Republican Party's patrimony. Trump and Trumpism, on this view, are the product of some intellectual crisis in conservatism. Domenech is skeptical of both positions. He seems to see Trump and Trumpism as the logical endpoint of something much more disturbing. As he put it recently, Trumpism is not the same as populism or the new right, and it speaks to something much worse than an intellectual crisis. It's what happens when no one trusts anyone anymore. Ben's here tonight to flesh that out for us. I have to say, been asked to say, that Ben will be glad to take questions from the audience after this talk. I hope it goes without saying, as the script goes, that OU seeks to provide opportunities for learning and free exchange of ideas, including events such as this one. In keeping with this goal, an opportunity for question and answer with Ben afterwards will follow. In the interest of ensuring an orderly event, audience members are asked to refrain from engaging in conduct that will disrupt the event. And when engaging in disruptive behavior will be subject to removal. I'm asked to read that. I don't always think it's probably necessary, just because that's, in a way, that's one of the reasons that I've put a lot of work into the Washington Forum for years. It's to make it a place where people can be civil, even with people with whom they disagree. So, questions, answers are answers, and both we ask will be civil. With that all said, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Ben Domenech here to OU tonight.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for coming out here tonight, particularly on this night, when I'm sure that there are more productive sporting activities that you could be paying attention to. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is my first time on campus. It's a beautiful campus, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to come out on an evening to talk about politics and the country at a time when a lot of people are feeling very uncertain, very anxious about the nation and its future. People on both sides of the political aisle. I think you saw that particularly this week. There have been so many stories, so much news that's come out over the course of this cycle, but this past week has to really take the cake in terms of the sheer amount of information that came out. Right before I came up here to speak, I was looking at some tweets from concerned people on the left side of the political spectrum who were openly talking about the fact that the FBI was engaged in assisting in a coup. Now, this is exaggeration, but it also speaks to the level of frustration that people are experiencing, where they feel like the institutions that make up our government, that make up our democracy, that are supposed to represent us, are at odds with us, or not interested in what we have to say, not interested in the people or in the citizenry, when their priorities are misplaced or in another direction. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk to you about tonight. We've seen over the course of the past 72 hours plus the reaction on TV media to Director Comey's comments from the FBI about the ongoing investigation into Secretary Clinton's emails, now connected to one related to one of her closest aides. And we've seen the backlash against him, that he was someone who was running down the idea of having a representative democracy, that people weren't going to trust the system anymore. Well, in seeing that on air, I just kept saying to myself, that's where people already are. They're already at that point. They already don't trust that our systems of government work in the way that they ought to. And I want to spend some time tonight talking a little bit about why that is, about where we came from, but particularly I want to talk about the rise of a new form of American populism. An American form of populism that is distinct, in my belief, from the kind of populism that you see in Europe, though it resembles it in some instances. Something that's distinct and different about it that makes it more American. And I also want to find some of the good things about it, because I think populism and its surge, whether on the left with Bernie Sanders or on the right with Donald Trump, sometimes gets more criticism than it necessarily deserves. I don't think the impulse is all that bad. So I want to talk to you for a minute, though, about The Federalist and what we do there. It's a publication I started a little more than 3 years ago. We have a daily podcast that goes out Monday through Friday called The Federalist Radio Hour. I would encourage you all to go to iTunes and sign up. We have some great guests, and the guests that we have run the gamut of left and right, of media figures, of cultural figures. And we talk to them, as I've been talking to them over the course of this election, about all of these crazy things that have gone on. I started The Federalist with a small group of people. We have a majority female staff, which is pretty unique in the political landscape. About half of our pieces are written by women. We have a higher level of women who read us compared to other places. We have a higher level of Democrats who read us than you might consider for a center-right publication. Almost a third of our readership identifies as Democrats. And one of the reasons for that is that we talk about culture first. We think that politics is downstream from culture, and that the things that are going on in our culture are bigger than our politics. The line that we take as our motto is be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray. It's from a speech that then Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge gave on the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he talked about the people who were there, people who were, for the most part, your age or maybe a little bit older. He talked about how they were fighting for a country, a nation, an idea of a nation that didn't exist yet. They were fighting for something that was going to be formed well after the battle, ages afterwards. And yet they still had the strength of will to stand up on Bunker Hill and to make the fight that they did. The line he has is, the boys of Bunker Hill were lovers of freedom, anxious for the fray, sons of Puritans who Macaulay tells us humbly bowed in the dust before their Lord, but hesitated not to set their foot on the neck of their king. There's a rebellious spine of stubborn contrariness that runs up and down the American body politic. It has since our inception. It is the motivation that gave rise to a resistance that rejected our king then and to the views of our elites today. This populism is, in my view, a healthy motivation. It can be turned in directions that are unhealthy, but properly directed, it represents the stubborn spirit that has time and again been of great help to our American nation. It can teach us to be stoic and tough and steel the American people against threats that seemed insurmountable. Coolidge spoke of a revolutionary generation that rejected the assumptions of the elites of their time in favor of a revolutionary idea of freedom. One such member of this generation was a descendant of Scots-Irish Highlanders, a frontiersman of a people free as only people on the frontier can be free. He loved freedom and a good fight. Born in a life of hardship, the son of Irish immigrants whose father died before his birth, This young son of the Appalachians grew up to see one brother die at the hands of the British, another starved to death as a prisoner of war, and a mother who died months later. When a British officer demanded this young man shine his boots, he refused. The officer slashed him with a saber, giving him a scar he would bear for life. He was 14. He did not forget, and he did not forgive. He relied on his wits. He learned the law. He became Tennessee's first congressman, one of its first senators, a justice of the Supreme Court, commander of the state militia. And when, on a January day in 1815, he had the opportunity to exact his revenge on the British for the deaths of his family, Andrew Jackson crushed the British Army at the Battle of New Orleans. If we are to understand what is particularly American about this brand of populism, it's impossible to do so without starting at the original populist, Andrew Jackson. When he ascended to national prominence as a general of volunteers, America was insecure and under threat on every side. The people were desperate for a strong leader to set things right, to represent their interests. When he arrived in Washington to hold the presidency, the festivities had the elites of Washington clutching their pearls. When he left the stage, our foes around the world had been utterly destroyed. Andrew Jackson has fallen into ill repute as of late. You might have noticed that the Democratic Party, which used to have Jefferson Jackson dinners, has kind of moved on from those. We're taking him off the $20 bill, which I would be personally fine with as long as the person who replaced him could have theoretically beaten him in single combat. The list is pretty short. He was the original political beneficiary of a populist moment in American politics. The corrupt bargain of the presidential election of 1824 was the original sin of cronyism and graft writ large in for the American electorate. His rejection of the pieties and the assumptions of the elites in this country and his advocacy for the respect and honor of the common man was essential to his elevation. He rode a populist surge into the White House and into the halls of history. We are living in another populist moment today. It's a moment born out of a surge of distrust and disgust with the institutions of American life. It is a moment that represents the breakdown of what could be described as the post-Cold War understanding of how our left-right politics works, fueled by a dramatic decline of trust in America's elites and the institutions they run. The percentage of Americans today with a great deal of trust in the presidency, in the courts, in the public schools, in banks, for unions, the justice system, big business, the Congress, and particularly the media, are at historic lows. In some cases, they are a rounding error away from zero. This decline in trust in American institutions is not new. It didn't happen overnight. It began with Watergate and Vietnam and continued through the financial crisis and Iraq. In response to real failures, we see undermined confidence in the capacity of elite institutions to do good and in their capability to represent the interests of the people they ought to. What we're witnessing today is a populist rebellion where Americans are reasserting themselves against a bipartisan political and cultural establishment utterly discredited due to their record of failure. This distrust was earned by elites who looked out for the interests of people other than those they were elected to serve. Rather than responding to the populist tendencies of the electorate with real changes, the elites overpromised and underdelivered. Republican elites thought that they could get by holding a musket over their heads in election years and doing what lobbyists wanted in other years. They, in particular, were comfortable in a bubble of economic success, a world away from the areas that saw no recovery in the wake of the recession. Elite indifference to populist opinion and to the economic pain many Americans continue to experience created a vacuum, one that Donald Trump was happy to fill. The key to understanding the Donald Trump phenomenon is to recognize that he is not a disease, nor is he a symptom. He is instead, for many Americans, the beta test of a cure. They are trying to fix this problem. It is no accident that since 1976, we've seen just one election for a new president, a non-incumbent president, that elected someone who ran other than being a political outsider. Jimmy Carter ran as an outsider, Ronald Reagan ran as an outsider, Bill Clinton ran as an outsider, George W. Bush ran as an outsider, and yes, Barack Obama ran as an outsider, trying to fix Washington, trying to fix a system that people believe no longer works for them. That has to tell you something about where the mind of the electorate is. In each of these areas, immigration, trade, foreign policy, Donald Trump breaks entirely with the elite consensus. Consensus that is favored by the donor class, by big business, and by party leadership to the exclusion of others. He has tapped into the fears and concerns of a group of disaffected Americans who see their country slipping away from them. There have always been limits, historically, to the success of American populists. You look at people like William Jennings Bryan, Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, they all experienced this. Just to put this in perspective for those of you who are younger, Pat Buchanan nearly won Iowa and won 4 out of the first 6 contests in 1996 before succumbing to Bob Dole. It was possible at one point that Trump looked like the same thing. In fact, many Republican prognosticators predicted he would experience something along those lines. But from my perspective, Trump actually has more in common with William Jennings Bryan. They certainly don't talk the same way. And I'm sure that William Jennings Bryan would not have tweeted that way. But the truth is that at the end of the 19th century, you had a situation where the Democrats were run by the bourbon Democrats, people who would have been writing for the Wall Street Journal if they were around today. They believed in free trade, they believed in a gold standard, they were essentially free marketers in a lot of different ways. And William Jennings Bryan came along, voiced the populist frustrations with their leadership, rejected the assumptions of the elites, and took over the Democratic Party with a speech. The problem is, of course, that that realignment in the end of the 19th century left the Democratic Party struggling to be a national party. In consecutive elections, Bryan received less and less votes on a national level, and ultimately it set up a situation where his party was taken over by a new breed of progressivism with Woodrow Wilson and others. The thing that I find interesting to hear from critics and analysts of this 2016 election that I've heard repeatedly from them is just a situation where they can't understand what's going on around them. They're looking around and they're saying, why did a Republican Party that nominated this nice Mormon businessman 4 years ago come around and nominate Donald Trump? I think that the answer is, in part that those who nominated Romney are not the same voters who nominated Trump. There were a lot of voters who had not typically participated in Republican primaries before who came out and voted for Trump eagerly. There's a new class of voter and participant who decided to engage in the system in 2016. People who typically do not represent the types of folks who choose a Republican nominee. The question is why? Why do people engage and vote when they rarely have in the past? The answer is that they're in the game now because the most precious prerogative available to any American is no longer extant, and that's the prerogative to ignore your government. Donald Trump has the appeal for these people of a traitor to his class, dispensing entirely with the politeness and the rules put upon politicians by a group of politically correct elites, telling it like it is. And they say, essentially, if the president is going to be an autocrat, let him be our kind of autocrat, somebody who will use the power to serve me and my interests and the interests of those like me. The mediating institutions that we have in our society failed to prevent this. The media failed in their coverage of this cycle for the same reason they failed in their coverage of Mitt Romney. It's easy to forget that the New York Times said things about Mitt Romney that were incredible in retrospect. They called him a charlatan. Paul Krugman said that Romney is completely amoral, a dangerous fool, ignorant as well as uncaring, unfit for office. He said he only pretended to care about poor people and wants people to die so the rich could get richer. Is anyone surprised that when Donald Trump comes along, any of these labels that are used by these media institutions are thrown out by his supporters because they say, you said that about the other guy too? The truth is that when you interact with the people that I do in green rooms and personally in Washington and New York, you saw very early on that the Trump phenomenon was different from the others. I would, over the course of months, ask people, is there anyone close to you? Do you have any close family or friends who are voting for Trump? And if so, why? And the answer that I got almost universally was no. I don't know anybody. I can't even think why someone would do it. The explanation is simple. Because the people became so disgusted with the failure of elites that in their desperation they turned to this man who promised to upend the system. They want that dramatic change just as they have done it in the past, but now they're more desperate, they're more anxious, because they feel like they voted in the past in this direction and it hasn't worked, it hasn't changed. Government just keeps rolling on. In Washington, everyone uses Donald Trump to vindicate their prior assumptions about what ought to happen in the country. You will hear various people blame the normal folks who you would put in these positions. So conservative talk radio, alt-right extremism, Fox News, the political establishment, the donor class, the debates, reality television, the rise of the Kardashians, among other causes. Some even sink to the level of blaming the desperate Americans who voted for Donald Trump for all of this, for everything that's gone wrong with the country. And they adopt Bertolt Brecht's attitude, his suggestion that it would be easier to dissolve the people and elect another. But a number of intelligent commentators on the left and the right have, in my view, settled on the issues that actually gave rise to Trump. And they gave it from a perspective that is pre-Trump, that didn't even involve his rise. And that's Chris Hayes' Twilight of the Elites from several years ago, and Charles Murray's Coming Apart. Two books which tell a story of dramatic failure on the part of the institutions run by America's elites, and it tells of the rise of a nostalgia for a time when such elites, such institutions could be trusted. Another book, Yuval Levin's book, The Fractured Republic, which came out this year, is the best explanation, in my view, for why this populist message has such modern appeal. Even in an era of technological advancement, when you have so many more things available to you as an American. The Fractured Republic was written over the course of the past 2 years or so, so it again comes pre the rise and nomination of Trump, but it helps explain this populist moment and why it's happening. Levin describes with compassion and empathy the failings of a nation that has combined the twin dangers of extreme individualism and centralized governance, while ignoring the frustrations of the working class. He tells where we've been as a nation, where we are, and why so many people are eager to shrug off the trend toward globalization and change the path in which we're headed. In his telling, American politics and culture is gripped by a crippling inability to adapt to the demands of the modern age because of a false perception of the nature of the country, driven in large part by the lasting power of the baby boomers. The siren song of this calling back to a time when jobs were stable, unions were strong, shared traditions provided a sense of underlying foundation, and our polity and culture were dominated by a handful of large institutions. It's a lure of a past rendered in a rosy glow. But the average baby boomer views this world through a very skewed lens. The reality is, the period of 1950 to 1970 was very much at odds with the rest of the American experience. You had large institutions of government that were trusted to a much greater degree than they had been in the past. You had the military eradication of America's biggest economic competitors, and it allowed for the rise of corporate behemoths like those never seen before. It's no accident that when, as a candidate, Donald Trump is asked to identify the last time that America was great, he cites the 1950s and the 1960s, a period when you had a far more unified vision of the American dream. We are driven by a nostalgia for a time when the world made sense, a time when America's common culture was driven overwhelmingly by underlying white identity politics. The vast majority of the country was Christian, at least in name, and employment was more stable and predictable than it is today in an economy exposed to global competition. But this wistfulness is blinding us to the truths about our current economic and social challenges. And it's not just the boomers who are animated by this counterproductive nostalgia. Many other institutions, including major media institutions, social movements, and Congress itself, are captured by this longing for the before time. Whether rooted in a desire for a system of government that still runs on earmarks and smoke-filled rooms, or a desire for a shared culture where everyone has to say Merry Christmas. Levin identifies a crippling nostalgia that is hardly monopartisan. His opening chapter again cites Paul Krugman's The Conscience of a Liberal, which came out in 2007. It's a characteristic example of the sort of homesickness, a longing for a time that got it right. Krugman describes his childhood in the 1950s as a paradise lost. It's the cultural dominance of this baby boomer vision, not as a period that breaks with the rest of our nation's history, but as an apotheosis of our greatness that has skewed politics to the point where many citizens don't realize they're longing for a time when schools were segregated, taxes were high, and you had to save for a year to buy a refrigerator. Americans have suffered a disconnect from the common, traditional, core institutions that make life in America better: family, faith, work, and neighborhood. At the same time, the failure of our policies to mitigate or moderate the dramatic changes in our economy and culture have left many Americans feeling abandoned by their government. Our entire system of welfare, healthcare, and entitlements is built for a bygone era, one that was the exception to the American economic experience, not the rule. Whether founded in the community or stood up by government, the failure of these mediating entities to meet the needs of the people has generated an enormous amount of distrust. Today, the American people view many of these institutions as irresponsible or corrupt, stagnant dinosaurs incapable of responding with speed to an advancing and evolving society. And they aren't wrong to view them that way. Coupled with a decline in shared values and cultural experiences, moving from an era when 2/3 of the television sets in the country were tuned to I Love Lucy to one where you have highly developed subcultures that thrive without any overlap, we see the disintegration of our commonly held vision. We no longer share in what it means to be an American, instead viewing the pursuit of happiness as a purely individual act of self-actualization. You can measure this collapse in trust in the decade and a half during which the American people have witnessed the 9/11 attacks, a failed war in Iraq, a bungled response to Katrina, a financial catastrophe, a Wall Street bailout, scandals in the Catholic Church, a failed stimulus, the embarrassing launch of Obamacare, a series of incomprehensible Supreme Court decisions, and the rise of the Islamic State. All things that serve to raise distrust for our elites and the institutions they run as even having a basic capability to lead us through this time of turmoil. Given the decline of trust in centralized institutions, one would not expect that Americans would favor investing more power in these entities. But that perspective represents a failure to understand what Alexis de Tocqueville and Robert Nisbet and others understand, that the rise of hyper-individualism and excessive centralization of government go hand in hand. As individuals become detached from those around them, detached from the sources of social order and meaning in their lives, they also become more desperate for strong, centralized leadership to make up for perceived failures. Levin writes, as a centralizing government draws power out of the mediating institutions of society, it leaves individuals more isolated, and as individualism further erodes the bonds that hold civil society together, people conclude only a central authority can pick up the slack. There's another nation that resembles this, in Mexican society, as described in Jorge Castaneda's 2011 book, Mañana Forever. In the United States, he writes, there are approximately 2 million civil society organizations, or one for every 150 inhabitants. In Chile, there are 35,000, or one for every 428 Chileans. In Mexico, there are only 8,500, one for every 12,000. 85% of all Americans belong to 5 or more organizations. In Mexico, 85% belong to no organization. In the US, 1 out of every 10 jobs is located in civil society. In Mexico, the equivalent figure is 1 out of every 210. In multiple polls taken in Mexico, a constant 82% of those surveyed stated that they had never worked formally or informally with others to address their community's problems. The end result is a nation where the hyper-individualized mob appeals to the strong centralized government for help, time and again. The expressive individualism that Levin identifies as being the ethic of our age lacks the understanding of self and what individuals require beyond mere self-liberation or the generous funding of personal priorities. This is a dangerous trend, one that must be channeled back toward a more beneficent understanding of what freedom requires of us. This point about individualism brings us to this question. How do we define a life well lived in the 21st century. People want to be happy, and every American has the right to pursue happiness. But what happens if what makes us happy and the methods we use to pursue it undergo dramatic change in ways that fundamentally alter the nature of the nation's long-standing political coalitions? Several recent books have addressed the phenomenon of large-scale demographic change from a variety of perspectives. Jonathan Last's What to Expect When No One's Expecting, Hannah Rosen's The End of Men, Kay Heimowitz's Manning Up, Helen Smith's Men on Strike. You're detecting a trend here. The demographic trends that we see tell a story about the rise of single America, the delay of family formation, the shifting definition of the life well lived. Together, these trend lines reveal the rise of a more individualist approach to living, one that prioritizes your career and personal interests over marriage, childbirth, and religion. This shift towards singlehood and away from family formation is notable for several reasons. It's unique in the American historical experience. Women and men are marrying later now than they have at any time in our history, and with that comes the drop in childbirth that we've seen, with trends that can't be explained away just by the recent economic downturn. This trend is primarily confined to the lower and middle earners. This discourages financial stability. It causes stagnation in their household budgets. But what may be most remarkable about this is how little those in the political sphere understand its potentially lasting significance. For much of the 20th century, the definition of the American dream was commonly held. It was a house, a patch of green, a white picket fence, a husband, a wife, a kid, a dog, a nice car, a nice neighborhood with a good school and safe streets. Achieving that dream involved a myriad paths, but the typical ones tended to make people gravitate toward a more traditionalist view as they approached middle age. Buying a house made you care about property taxes. Balancing a family budget made you care about income taxes and gas and grocery prices. Owning a small business made you care about burdensome regulations. Having children made you care about what programming was on television, what dangers existed in the world. Typically, they sent you back to church. You started to care about the school board and what the teacher was actually teaching your children. Perhaps you had your first negative experience with the teachers union. And then you started to worry about debt and deficits, the rising cost of the state, mindful that you spend more and more time each year, it feels like, working not for yourself and your family, but for the government and its dependents. These experiences lend themselves to a certain commonly held view of consistent cross-generational priorities and civic values. But today we see the traditional pathway toward the American dream dissolving. Families are forming later, if at all. They're breaking up with astonishing regularity for lower-income Americans. There's an increasing disengagement from civil society, diminishing church attendance. The financial crisis of 2008 was driven in large part by something always essential to the American dream, the idea of owning your own home. The home ownership rate in America today is the lowest it has been since 1965. What's going on here is bigger than government. It's bigger than political parties. The state has undoubtedly fomented it. It's bigger than economics, but through perverse economic incentives, those have contributed. And it's bigger than our culture, though our culture has certainly been an accelerating agent. What we are witnessing is nothing less than the death of the shared vision of the American dream, something that we're now only noticing in its absence. The common belief in the importance of strong families and neighborhoods as essential to the American dream was the greatest hedge against expansive centralized government. But without the underlying philosophical consensus, which has been at the heart of the American experience since its inception, there is no long-term basis for a common understanding of how we define rights and responsibilities. And without that consensus, things fall apart. One of the things that falls apart is political coalitions. For roughly half a century, the American right succeeded politically by following the fusionist path charted by Frank Meyer. Meyer was an intellectual ex-communist who turned libertarian, and he argued for an alliance of libertarians, conservatives, and anti-communists toward common aims. He aimed to bridge the gap between individualists and communitarians, writing in 1964 that truth withers when freedom dies, however righteous the authority that kills it, and free individualism, uninformed by moral value, rots at its core and soon brings about conditions that pave the way for surrender to tyranny. Meyer's approach led to a coalition which supported the rise of conservatives based on the concept of a three-legged stool: fiscal conservatism, traditional values, and a strong national defense. The seat atop the legs of that stool was communism during the Cold War, and then briefly, really just for the election of 2004, it was Islamic terrorism. But in the wake of the Cold War and the post-Iraq foreign policy shifts on the right, this Meyer-era coalition has crumbled. His approach needs to be updated for the post-Cold War reality, and it's incumbent upon a new generation of leaders within the Republican Party and elsewhere to do so. Our current elites have failed to understand this. They've failed to connect with the American people, they've failed to meet the test of competency, and they've failed to live up to their promises. And that brings us to the starting point where any new political coalition must begin, with respect. The reason for today's populist revolt, above all, is a lack of respect. There is nothing more important than respect. It represents the implicit and sincere acceptance of democratic civic equality. The populist supporters of Donald Trump know the elites do not respect them or care for their plight. Over and over, they've been told by the elites, you're not allowed to want that thing. And they're fed up with it. To the establishment in Washington, in both political parties, this looks like chaos. It looks like savagery. It looks to some people like a coup. But to many people, it looks like democracy, a desperate expression of it, yes, but democracy nonetheless. Angelo Codevilla, who's a professor and historian, wrote a few years ago, America is now ruled by a uniformly educated class of persons that occupies the commanding heights of bureaucracy, of the judiciary, education, the media, and of large corporations, and that wields political power through the Democratic Party. Its control of access to prestige, power, privilege, and wealth exerts a gravitational pull that has made the Republican Party's elites its satellites. This class's fatal failure is its belief that ordinary Americans are a lesser intellectual and social breed. Its increasing self-absorption, its growing contempt for whoever won't bow to it, its dependence for votes on sectors of society whose grievances it stokes, have led it to break the most basic rule of Republican small r life, deeming its opposition illegitimate, unquote. Our American politics is broken today because of a bipartisan alliance formed over decades between large institutions, an alliance which socializes risk, prevents competition, and rigs the playing field in ways that hurt family pocketbooks, crush innovation, and encroach on individual liberties. Today, government and its partner bigs, banks, business, labor, ag, and their armies of lobbyists represent a common enemy to both communities and to individuals. Organic communitarianism depends on individual agency and autonomy in the market and civil society. The breakdown of our ability to self-govern is collateral damage brought about by a war on individual liberty and the rise of an illiberalism in America and, as we see, around the world, by those who seek to absorb, marginalize, or extinguish institutions of civil society which compete with the state. Bureaucratic rule is pervasive, but for many Americans, there is no legitimacy to it anymore. They no longer feel like their votes have made a difference, that this process actually works. Facing such a systemic problem, so widespread, so true in all areas of our life, populists today reject technocratic, incremental approaches. They don't want to settle for just tweaking the system. They instead want to pursue more dramatic ends. They aim to tear down the elites and their institutions, root and branch, and end the systems which have enabled their power grab. Where the Tea Party of 2010 aimed at returning power and prosperity from the bigs to American individuals and families through free markets, civil society, and limited constitutional government, today's populist surge goes far further. It aims to scrap this small government ideology altogether. Instead, it demands a strong leader, a leader who respects the people and disrespects the elites to put things right. Donald Trump assures voters that he will use authoritarian power for good, to help those who feel, with good reason, ignored by both parties. But the American experiment in self-government was the work of a generation that risked it all to defeat a tyrannical monarch, establishing a government of laws, not of men. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people is precisely what the Constitution offers, and what is most threatened by great men who are impatient to impose their will on the country. At its worst, this represents nothing more than hollow European-style identity politics. But conservatives have far more to learn from the rise of Trump and from this populist moment than many might like to admit. I know Trump voters. I know many of them. Many of them are normal Americans, everyday Americans. Many of them you might be surprised, or I think my liberal friends in Washington and New York would be very surprised that they are voting for Donald Trump. But I also know some of the reasons why they vote for Donald Trump. It's interesting, in the course of this election, there was a study done by Gallup that found that it wasn't your own economic pain that determined whether you were one of Trump's most eager supporters. It was your proximity to that pain. The Trump voter is moderate, disaffected, patriotic. He feels disconnected from our institutions, left behind by this national elite. If you are one of millions of middle-aged, unemployed white Americans with a high school degree, you recognize this. Today, there are 7 million men in prime working age who've dropped out of the labor force. That's higher than we've seen since the end of the Great Depression. There are millions more who know these people. They know them as their father, their son, their uncle, their friend. Moved from the unemployment extended benefits during the recession to the disability program, people like this receive enough benefits to subsist, around $1,200 a month on average, and to pay for the alcohol and drugs that help them self-medicate. Alan Kruger, one of the president's advisors now at Princeton, released a study just a few months ago that found 44% of these 7 million men took painkillers yesterday. 2/3 of them were prescription. Your life is essentially one marked by hopelessness, desperation, and anxiety. You are statistically unlikely to ever re-enter the workforce. And alone among all demographics in the United States today, your likelihood of suicide is rising. The things that made your life not just endurable but happy are religious faith, now lost to you, family, which is fractured, community, which is disintegrated, and work, which you find hard to come by. And when the TV screen flickers with images of people living lives you could never hope to emulate, you realize how bleak your situation is. Our soma is better, but it is not a replacement for the pursuit of happiness. And then a golden-haired man comes on TV, a man who represents a vision of what you might have hoped your life might be like, a man who defies the elites, who is rich and successful, who comes from the world of the elites, but is strong enough to reject them and their lies. And he tells you it's not your fault. Your life is the way it is. It's the fault of immigrants and bad trade deals and wasteful, pointless wars. He tells you the problem with elites is not that they are too conservative or that they're too liberal. It's not that they're unprincipled. It's that they're stupid and they don't care about you. He tells you with confidence that he alone can make everything great again. And you listen. This is why I believe fundamentally that Trump's rise, for all of its negative aspects, actually reveals something good about the country. President Obama's core domestic policy agenda was designed to pull working and middle-class voters left. It assumed once you received the government's redistributive largesse, you'd be invested in maintaining it and maintaining his party in power. Trump's rise tells us that that's been a failure. The fact is that the American working class has seen this agenda up close, and they don't believe it's good enough to make the nation great. These disaffected Americans can be won by those who represent and by those who respect the pro-American Jacksonian spine that runs through this electorate. The challenge now is for those who believe in free markets and in individual liberty to give these voters the respect that they deserve. Mark Twain wrote, "For in a republic, who is the country? Is it the government, which for the moment is in the saddle? Why, the government is merely a servant, merely a temporary servant. It cannot be its prerogative to determine what is right and what is wrong, and decide who is a patriot and who isn't. Its function is to obey orders, not originate them." The danger is that it's possible the American people are too far gone down this road, set to bing back and forth between servitude and license. As Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about it, there are some nations in Europe whose inhabitants think of themselves in a sense as colonists, indifferent to the fate of the place they live in. The greatest changes occur in their country without their cooperation. They are not even aware of precisely what has taken place. They suspect it. They have heard of it by chance. More than that, they are unconcerned with the fortunes of their village, the safety of their streets, the fate of their church and its vestry. They think that such things have nothing to do with them, that they belong to a powerful stranger called the government. They enjoy these goods as tenants without a sense of ownership and never give a thought to how they might be improved. They are so divorced from their own interests that even when their security and that of their children is finally compromised, they do not seek to avert the danger themselves, but cross their arms and wait for the nation as a whole to come to their aid. When a nation has reached this point, it must either change its laws and mores or perish, for the well of public virtue has run dry. In such a place, one no longer finds citizens, but only subjects. He also said in 1848, after returning to France and helping set up a new form of government there, he described the experience that he had in France of seeing the latest revolution coming. I read this the other day, and it just struck me as being such a description of our own times. He says, "Is it consistent with democracy to institute the most meddlesome, all-encompassing, and restricted government, provided that it be publicly chosen and that it act in the name of the people? Would the result not be tyranny under the guise of legitimate government, and by appropriating this legitimacy, assuring to itself the power and omnipotence which it would otherwise assuredly lack? What made me believe that revolution was approaching, what actually produced the revolution, was this: power, influence, honors, one might say life itself, were being confined to the narrow limits of one class, such that no country in the world presented a like example. That is what made me believe that revolution was at our door. I saw what would happen to this privileged class, that which always happens when there exist small, exclusive aristocracies. Corruption increased every day, intrigue took the place of public virtue, and all deteriorated. Thus, the upper class. And among the lower classes, what was happening? Increasingly detaching themselves, both intellectually and emotionally, from those whose function it was to lead them. The people at large found themselves naturally inclining toward those who were well disposed toward them, among whom were dangerous demagogues and ineffectual utopians." This to me seems like a good description of what we've gone through in 2016. A people who are at odds with their elites, separated from their elites, at odds really with the priorities of a class, a leadership class, and a bureaucratic class that no longer cares about them. But there is still something special about America that should give us hope. And that's just the difference in the nature of our people. In the concluding chapter of his book, Levin makes the case for the citizen, the need for citizens themselves to understand that this is about something bigger than just who you elect. He argued that we've underappreciated the importance of Americans to the American project, that our highly individualist, liberationist idea of liberty is possible only because we presuppose the existence of a human being and citizen capable of handling a remarkably high degree of freedom and responsibility. We do not often enough reflect on how extraordinary it is that our society contains so many people. We have to move beyond the sentimental politics of baby boomers seeking to restore an economic and cultural reality that no longer exists. We instead need to build up the mediating institutions that sustain our system of self-government. The rise of American populism is due to the breakdown of faith in our institutions and our elites. The American people are, in some sense, demanding a better class of leader, a better class of elites. Our politics in 2016 has been warped by the nostalgia of the baby boomers, but it doesn't need to stay that way. It will be our people who determine whether we do so or not, though, not our politics. America has survived incredible things. At key moments in our history, when all could be lost, when the odds were stacked against us, we have won through. And that Jacksonian spine has been part of it. The risks our founding fathers took in the course of making this great experiment in self-government are not easily forgotten. There is a stoic heart in our country that beats strong and that has answered the call time and again. America was founded on a belief that we are not prisoners of our destiny or our blood, but that the world we can pass on to our kids can exceed the one that we were born into. This is not a uniquely American belief, it's a human one, but not all cultures acknowledge or honor it. It was here in America where this belief was uniquely understood from our inception, in our creed, that we are born with an equal claim to life, to liberty and to the pursuit of whatever lies beyond that far horizon. To deny this, to turn to the false prophets of authoritarians, whether nationalist or utopian, is to break faith with our own humanity and reject what is best about ourselves. Yes, there are reasons to be scared. We're witnessing a fight over what our nation is going to be. The elites are craven and corrupt, and the people are calling out for aid. And if those of us who believe in freedom and individual liberty aren't the ones who answer, the authoritarians will. It's the American people, though, in all their forms, varied, courageous, humble, ambitious, and free, who will together determine whether we will move on from this wistful obsession with the past to be one nation after all. Be not afraid of this populist moment. We are a blessed nation, and no matter what comes, the American idea is too strong to be eradicated by one man, one candidate, or one movement. It lives in our hearts. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
You just said that there's a danger that the authoritarians will jump into this vacuum to answer this problem. But on the right, there's a very strong contingent of never Trumpers, from Bill Kristol or Jonah Goldberg, Ben Sass, some of these guys that are for individual freedom and liberty and like that. But they're fighting against, or they seem to be fighting against this, what Trump seems to be fulfilling. Is there a danger that we are hurting ourselves, so to speak?
So just to, I think one of the things, we've learned a lot of things about what makes up the Republican Party this cycle, of what that coalition actually looks like. It's more secular, it's less ideological, it's less dedicated to a lot of principles when it comes to trade and immigration and some other things than I think a lot of people thought. I think really prior to this cycle, we had a lot of misunderstanding about who was actually fighting each other. The Republican DC Beltway establishment thought that their biggest problem was these, crazy guys who hold up the Constitution and wear tri-corner hats. And it turned out that wasn't the guy they needed to worry about. and actually, I think that one thing that does give me significant hope about some of the people that you mentioned, less the media folks than those who've been elected, is this is probably the last election where the baby boomers will own everything. That gives me enormous hope, okay? Because that, to me, is, I don't want to lay it all at the feet, and no offense to those of you who are in the room who are from that large generation, but I think that the warping effect of that nostalgia has been so powerful, and you have two candidates who are, certainly, advanced in age compared to the others who are in the field. I think that part of this is a shift in generational leadership that needs to happen. The difficulty, I think, for Republicans is they are a very hierarchy-driven party in terms of Washington. They really do believe that you're the oldest guy, you get to sit in the chair. And the problem with that is these are people who are very much at a distance from what's really going on in the country right now and the trend lines, what people are talking about. There are young figures, though, particularly in the US Senate, but in the US House as well, who are Gen Xers, who are millennials, who are rising and who are becoming more relevant. I think the sooner that generational change happens, the better. The worst case scenario from my perspective, though, would be that in the wake of this election, Republicans essentially all get together in Washington and say, we're just gonna pretend none of that happened, okay? We're just gonna, okay, yeah, whatever. There was an election in 2016, I don't remember anything like that. And they're just gonna roll out the same policies and the same leaders and the same approach. When Brexit happened in the UK, David Cameron went out and said, look, I was opposed to this. I let you have a vote on it. I was at odds with you. I'm now going to do the honorable thing and I'm going to step aside because I should not be the leader of a coalition that has rejected fundamentally what I have to offer. You know, I think unfortunately, particularly in the US Senate after this election, you have 3 older white guys who are essentially their leaders right now. You have diverse members of the Senate who could easily take those jobs and probably would be better at it. And I think it's just a question of whether one of them is going to stand up and have the gumption to challenge one of the leaders there and really say the face of this party, of this coalition, needs to change, and here's my plan for how it needs to change to meet the needs of these people without going down the road toward authoritarianism and nationalism.
This brand of populism, do you think will have a bigger impact in the long run, Bernie's or Trump's?
That's a big question. I think in the long run, Bernie's brand of populism is actually the thing that has a longer tail to it, in part because take for example the issue of Obamacare. Bernie's solution is to basically say this was a corporatist solution that tried to lay on this layer of government over the insurers and to make them do these different things. I'm just going to short circuit that whole thing. You know, we're going to go through to a policy that's more honest about what we're trying to achieve, more direct. I think the other reason that it could have a longer tail is that, assuming that Hillary Clinton wins, which is what most prognosticators believe, and a belief that I share, I think that Trump will overperform his numbers, but I think that she will be the next president. Where do those voters go? Because she's really not going to deliver on the promises that she's had to make to them over the course of the past couple of years, in my opinion, in part because she's going to have such a challenge of working with, you know, potentially Republicans in the House who are going to be unwilling to do a lot of these things. Hillary Clinton's career is clear. She's very clear about what she is. She is someone who works well with corporate America, who is very buddy-buddy with Wall Street and the banks, who's not going to engage in the kind of significant things that populists who support Bernie really wanted. And I think that that's going to create a vacuum on the left where a lot more people will run to that message because that's going to be the way to win the next generation of voters.
Will there be, in your opinion, will there be a historically high youth turnout, or will it kind of underperform?
I think it will underperform. I mean, what do you think? I don't know about, when I talk to young people, and I do go to campuses with regularity, when I talk to young people, I don't hear excitement. You know, I heard excitement in 2008. There was a lot of hope in 2000. Again, an outsider change agent, someone who was going to really turn things around and give us optimism and hope about the future. When I talk to young people today, usually the first thing that they mention is, well, I'm voting for this person to block the other one. And I think that that's a sentiment that is only going to lead to, you know, certainly less turnout than you would have seen under the Obama regime. Also, I just think that it's just a harder sell. Even if you have the same, you know, people working with the Clintons now who worked with him to drive up turnout in a lot of different key demographics. You know, I just think it's a harder sell, and I don't blame young people for being turned off on politics after this cycle. If anything, I hope it drives them to engage with all these other areas which I think are more important.
In regards to what you said about how presidential candidates who have won been ran as outsiders, how do you explain incumbency and how she said, and the fact that we've only had 2 presidents since the era you mentioned that have lost re-election?
I think that incumbency means incumbency is a situation where you have a lot of things already invested in you that give you an advantage as a candidate. The other thing is that you can conceivably argue that my process, my approach, my policies have not been fully applied or fully implemented. I think that was a key, frankly, to President Obama's re-election, that he could basically say, look, I have passed this thing that hasn't really kicked in yet, and honestly, I wonder if it would have been different if it had kicked in a year earlier or something like that. I think you could have seen a situation where people might have turned on him in that sense. From my perspective, it's just a representation that America has been less and less interested in electing people who are viewed as creatures of Washington. The irony of the situation we're in right now is that we're about to elect somebody who is very much a known quantity and has a long political history. And frankly, if she takes office, barring some amazing turnaround in her poll numbers, she will do so as probably the least popular first-term president in the entire past, in the modern era. And that's going to be difficult for her, difficult to govern, difficult to have a mandate. And so but she's also someone who's used to using the levers of power, and we'll see how she uses them, whether she continues down this road that Obama has done of using bureaucracy and the administrative state as a substitute for finding bipartisan solutions or triangulation. Anybody? Just in the back, since he has it. All right.
So you talked about the unpopularity that there's also Donald Trump, but with Republicans, you kind of seen, like you mentioned, Congressman, like most probably Speaker Ryan, at least express hesitation with Donald Trump, and with publications such as like the National Review, obviously, right, for him. But why do you think there hasn't been as much voices on the left kind of express that?
That's a good question. I don't know, isn't that funny? Because you'd think, just given the litany of history of scandals and problems and basic incompetence, and you'd think that would be asked a lot more. It's funny that our media doesn't ask that question. So I cut the cord a couple of years ago. Even though I'm on TV, I don't actually watch the programs I'm on. But I got cable back. I actually got PlayStation View back a couple of months ago because I wanted to see the baseball playoffs, and so I saw CNN for the first time in an extended amount of time, and I was amazed because they would just go on for hours. Just the other day they went on. I had it on in the background. It was for about 3 hours, and they had panel after panel after panel where there wasn't a single person supporting a candidate who's getting 40 to 45% of the vote in polls. Not one, and they're asking analysts who have come out, and Republican analysts who've come out and supported Hillary Clinton or said that, Trump's unacceptable, analyzing what he ought to do or things along those lines. I understand that when they're producing these TV shows, when the media has a slant, but I do think it's a significant demonstration of why people don't trust media, that you see these questions directed in only one way. When I was watching, I saw them go after James Comey and say, how unacceptable is this? And how unprecedented is this? And isn't this a violation of understood protocol and things like that to publicize this investigation? They interviewed multiple people who had criticized him for it. And I think for Americans who have a different view than that, they just look at it and they say, are they even going to pretend my view exists? Are they even going to pretend that there's an alternative to what they're presenting here? And I think that's one of the reasons why, again, the media has received so much flack this cycle, and it's been revelatory for them to realize how little heft they have with the American people now. And I think that's with good reason. 3 over here, so you and then, okay.
So you've spoken a great deal of domestic consensus, and it seems that, at least for much of our history, we had those moments of consensus that was predicated on an external existential threat. Do you think that's what we needed to kind of spark whatever consensus may come out of this again? Or I think that's not?
I hope not, but I think that's possible. We're entering, this is an incredibly fractious period around the world. How many wars are we currently fighting? How many of those are legal? That's a different question. But the thing for me is, how can we find that consensus absent that? Will it take another massive economic downturn? Will it take a war that breaks out in a serious way? Will it take some terrorist attack to bring us together? I would hope that we can find ways to bring each other closer to each other, to reach out across the boundaries that currently exist, to get rid of some of this atomization without some terrible threat level external event. Let's not buy into the Watchmen thesis that we need a giant squid to show up, okay? I'm hopeful that it's going to be something that is more gradual and that involves more of us working together in a neighborhood fashion. I think localism is so key to this, and caring about, there's a line from C.S. Lewis about how the danger of newspapers is that all the troubles of the world arrive on your doorstep every morning, and you can fall into the trap of feeling like you can't do anything because you can't do anything about people dying overseas in a place, or people, and what that actually does is it can lead you to shrink away from your neighborhood, from the things you actually can do something about. I think social media does the same thing today. So,
So I'm glad you focused on culture because I'm glad you didn't result to the whole like economics explains this. It's like poor rural whites are driving Trump because it's not. It's middle class suburban people are much bigger effect. But I guess my question is sort of where do you see the future of technocracy? I mean, I think Clinton really embodies this. This idea that we have all the data, we know all the solutions. If you don't go along with this and you're just wrong or ignorant or whatever. So I think a few years ago when Megan McArdle wrote for the Daily Beast, she had this great article called the Rise of the Mandarins.
Yes.
Or whatever. I think that's spot on in terms of what a lot of this is about and the fear that there's no opportunity for anyone if you're not within those circles, and those circles will defend those opportunities for their kids to death. I guess, do you think there's going to be a peak if Clinton gets in where sort of this fails and some beautiful classical liberal alternative emerges and everyone comes out happy? Where do you think this goes?
I think that I think that the Rise of the Mandarins, which is a great piece that Megan McArdle wrote many years ago, she also has a very good book about failure, which you should all read. The thing that is problematic for the Mandarin class at the moment is that particularly those on the left of center have had a series of failures when it came to the policies that they recommended. And I would say that when it comes to Hillary Clinton, that would be my concern as well, is in the sense that what's left out of this whole storyline is what is she going to do differently? How is she going to do it? I still don't know what she's going to try to do. I feel like the situation may end up being one where, Paul Ryan and the House Republicans basically say, show us your best ideas for how to fix this. And those ideas may not work. They may not be convincing. I think that one of the things that we need to undergo is really a transition within that class to let in new ideas and new people, particularly younger people who come from outside the world of the accepted political reality, let's put it that way, in the sense that Washingtonians in particular have this idea that there are certain things that are inconceivable. You can never do that or try to do that or move in this direction. But I think that getting in some of these younger voices that don't necessarily have those preconceptions which again are founded in an era that no longer exists. Okay, you can go back and you can look at the way that Congress worked in the 80s and the 90s, and it doesn't work that way today, and it's not going to go back. And so the key is to get some people who aren't used to, well, we just need to get back to the old way of doing things because we're not going back there. And I think that that's a process that unfortunately is going to be stalled while she's in office because her tight-knit circle of people is very much loyalists who have been close to them for a while and doesn't have that kind of younger, more innovative approach to rethinking the way we do policy. So.
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. I wanted to go back to the collective vision that you were talking about. You sort of laid out what the classic American dream is, right? And that was predominantly, not exclusively white, and you said that was the shared collective dream. It was not of all people, it was sort of a culturally predominant dream. So I think one thing that has happened is we have sort of introduced these other American dreams and these other American experiences into the cultural fold, right? And which I think is a good thing, to clarify. I think that we will benefit in the long term for having done that. What do you see as steps to begin now to create this collective, a new collective vision? And do you think it happens on the federal level, or do you think it happens on the community level across the country?
I think it's entirely the local. I mean, I think this is something where it's no accident that the population that was most resistant to Donald Trump's message was the Mormons. Okay, I mean, you're talking about close-knit communities, strong family bonds, strong religious faith, some of the lowest levels of drug abuse relative to the rest of the country, fewer broken families. Of course, every community has its own problems, but the point is the strength of that community helped mitigate a lot of the fears and anxieties that Trump played off on in sending this message to people, because they don't see it the same way. And that's why Utah may be going to this random independent candidate. Who I interviewed on my radio show, you should go back and listen to it because he says some interesting things. But the thing that is that to me we ought to emulate on that. I'm not saying we should all go out and become Mormons, but I'm just saying that let's start thinking in our own communities about things that are attributes that they have that make their communities strong, that can be emulated. And I think that requires us, I keep stressing this over and over to people, it's not about who's sitting in the White House. Like, that doesn't change based on who sits in the White House. Even if it was a race between Hillary Clinton and Marco Rubio, that wouldn't be something that would change on, or Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz, it wouldn't change. The communitarian bonds that we have are fraying and broken, particularly among lower income white communities that have never come back from the economic crisis. Staten Island went hard for Donald Trump. Southwest Virginia went hard for Donald Trump. This is not just the sort of thing that can be explained by economic issues. It's about something more. It's about the fact that we've lost this connectiveness and we no longer trust each other or our institutions or our elites to be looking out for us. And I think that the best way to mitigate that, the best way to push back against that, is to start looking out for each other and to start demonstrating in your own life, in the way that you relate to others around you, whether that's forming community organizations, whether it's doing things that are that are consistent with whatever faith tradition you have, or whether it's just being more active in terms of your neighborhood and your community. I think that's where things really start. We can't just sit in our apartments on our laptops typing about Boko Haram. We have to start caring about what's going on in our neighborhood.
So I'm curious about your next generation of policymaker or politician, Gen X or the millennial. What kind of policies could they put forth that would break this nostalgia trap that Trump voters would go for and would find appealing? Because it seems what Trump is putting forth in terms of economics is kind of nationalism and protectionism that wouldn't promise the jobs that you would need to sort of rebuild this community. Yeah. I'm not sure what he necessarily offers for this communitarian vision that you're talking about. What could that doesn't involve any form of statism, right? So it removes the impetus from the federal level and returns it to the level which.
I think one of the biggest things that they can change is stop thinking about things like tax and welfare policy through the lens that they traditionally have, and start looking at it more through the lens of what will actually help working class Americans. A good example of this would be in tax policy. The whole debate over the past couple of years on the right was, how do we tweak the system to better benefit those who have lots of kids, because they're getting squeezed by all of these different things that cost so much within our society, healthcare, higher ed, and other things that they want to sort of mitigate. And there were all different ways to do that, through child tax credits and through various, forget that. From my perspective, a fundamental change that could shift this is if any of these free marketers decided to take up the idea that we should get rid of the payroll tax. It's a tax that affects every working American. It affects your bottom line. It's a tax that hurts you more if you're on the lower end of the spectrum. And particularly for those Americans who say, well, one of the reasons that I don't get married is that I don't have enough money in my pocketbook. The lure of a child tax credit after you knock up your girlfriend is not going to be the same thing as if you actually put more money in somebody's pocket today. The other thing that does is it ends the fiction that we've allowed to persist, that the payroll tax is something that is put into some kind of lockbox and saved for the next generation when it comes to our entitlements. So it also drives the conversation about how we fix that problem. I think that there are a number of populist ideas that are out there that I think can be gathered together in terms of addressing the concerns that a lot of Americans have when it comes to the things that they purchase that they view as fundamental to the quality of life that they have, and that really look to solve those problems. When it comes to higher ed, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to even something as simple as America's food policy. This is not something that you hear politicians talk about regularly. But what are we doing to make sure that Americans can spend less money on the food that they buy? What are we doing to get rid of the things that drive up those costs? We have all sorts of warping policies within our government that deal directly with gas and grocery and other prices along those lines, and I think that that's something that would be good for them to do. But I think more fundamentally, when it comes to the next generation stuff, what they have to do, from my perspective, is start driving the idea that Congress needs to find new ways to assert its role in checking the executive. They have a constitutional responsibility to engage in that, and Congress has three basic tools that they can use to do that: nominations, impeachment, and spending. And two of those, basically, the Congress has decided they can't really use anymore, because on spending, it takes a crisis to get even something as small as a sequester, and then you have all the Republicans who want to spend more money on military things, trying to roll that back. And then, on impeachment, they're not willing to impeach officials, even if, people like the current IRS commissioner, who has enormous questions about him. And then on nominations, typically what you see is deal cutting, which ends up putting people like Loretta Lynch into power. And so, from my perspective, it's about getting a new generation of leaders who don't view the world through the lens of the 90s and the 80s and bipartisan deal making, and the people want us to govern, and that means our priority needs to be the TPP and the Keystone Pipeline. That's just not the things that they should be prioritizing. I think they need to get back to an agenda. It's more about working families, and that prioritizes things that really hit people's pocketbooks. But again, the overall point I would make is that doesn't solve any of the problems that we have that led us to this point. That's something good, or something that I think would benefit the country and benefit working families, but it's not going to be the solution to the overall problem. Either one of you, I don't know who went first.
Do you think one of the ways that we could prevent a sort of elitist attitude among our leaders would be to set term limits on Congress, or do you think that would be dangerous?
So I have come around a little bit on term limits. I used to be opposed to it because my basic rationale was this: there's more bad politicians than good politicians. So if you get a good one, you want to be able to keep them. But I think that the power of incumbency and the ability of incumbents to skew elections and the system to benefit themselves has gotten so out of control that I think we may need to have something that is different. One thing that I think would actually go a long way toward doing that is to completely, so within the Congress, the way seniority works has a key role to play in terms of how long people stay there. Once they lose that gavel, it's not fun anymore, and they tend to leave and go and become lobbyists or what have you. Some of them say they're going to spend time with their family, but Joe Scarborough said that, and look at him now. So the thing though that I think could really help with that is dramatically reforming the way inside these institutions that chairmanships work, and that being the lead on each of these committees work, so that there's a lot more turnover. If you have more turnover internally and people aren't able to hold on to power as long as some of these committee chairs are, where every aspect of policy flows through them, I think that would be a good thing. I actually would also like to see a situation though where we have a more responsible approach to staffing. I know this is very inside baseball, but back in the 80s and 90s, one of the things that was true about congressional staffers is that they tended to look a lot more like your professors, and now they tend to look a lot more like you. And the difference was that basically the class of people who were working in those jobs got priced out of them, where they didn't have enough budget to pay for some guy who's got a master's, to handle an area of policy. So what the effect of that is that the committee staff ended up being the only staffs that really have sort of higher level, well-educated people who are working on policy. In the personal offices, you've got a bunch of people who just worked on a guy's campaign, and now you're a 26-year-old and somebody's coming in and asking you about ag or labor policy, and you're like, I'm new here, So I actually would be in favor of increasing some of these congressional staffs to the point where they can afford to have some more professional people, because what we've actually seen happen in Washington is bureaucrats at these various agencies run roughshod over the congressman, because the congressman doesn't know enough about the issue, doesn't even sometimes read their briefing papers before they go into committee hearings. Congressmen, in terms of how they work, don't really have the role that we want them to have in terms of checking the executive branch. And so because of that, you see them not fulfilling the type of representation that I think the American people want them to have.
So this election, more than 2008 at least, has been so much less issue focused this vote. And one of the issues that I've been painfully sad to see go, and it's not been talked about very much at all, is foreign policy. Why do you think neither candidate has wanted to address it?
Well, I mean, I think Hillary Clinton doesn't want to address it because of her record in that area. I think that, you know, Donald Trump sounds a note of being opposed to war generally, being opposed to expensive war. What I think he's actually just opposed to is anything that he views as being a losing effort. We need to have a real serious conversation about foreign policy in the country. Part of the downside of the fact that no prominent candidate ran in 2008 from the Bush administration is that you never had a great argument about that in the primary, which normally would have happened in a situation where a vice president was running afterwards, or where there was somebody else, you know, who came forward who represented those views. You didn't have anybody like that running. You didn't have Connie Rice running. You didn't have, you know, and so because of that, that whole conversation just kind of stuck in amber for 8 years, and you saw that play out here in this presidential cycle, where Jeb Bush has basically asked whether the Iraq war is a mistake, and it looks like he hasn't even thought about it. From my perspective, the argument that needs to happen, the argument that needs to happen on the foreign policy front really comes down to how do we determine what our foreign policy is so that we aren't just reactive. If you're reactive, then you view whatever the new terrible story is and say, we've got to do something about that. I would argue that we haven't had a coherent foreign policy really since the end of the Cold War. We don't really know what our priorities are. And we are very slow to come to grips with, I guess, a skepticism about what we're able to achieve. One of the things that, you know, President Obama has certainly, you know, a determining factor in his presidency is the fact that he arrived in office and didn't want to get involved in any more wars, didn't want to get involved in any more quagmires. And now we see him going out, and we're involved in more places, and it looks like we're going to have to go back. And, you know, lots of people are very frustrated. Well, clearly, you know, he tried to do something and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? We need to have that conversation. I think, unfortunately, the fact that so many of the more hawkish Republicans are either openly or implicitly supporting Hillary Clinton is something that should prompt a debate about this, but currently isn't. And I hope that more people will stand up and have that argument, because I think we would benefit from it as a nation. And certainly, I come from a military family, and I'm sure many of you do as well. This is something that matters a lot to a lot of us who have brothers and friends who are currently in, and who we don't want to see thrown overseas on a mission that doesn't have a clear plan of what we want to achieve and how we're going to get out after. Sure.
So you mentioned National View, and I think it was Kevin Williamson had a piece in there where he said, and one of the things you do, right, about if you live in Biggs County or Benton County, one of these counties right near us, where there are a lot of Trump signs, a lot of the sort of disaffection is get a U-Haul, is move, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, I think it sort of maybe relates to Paul's question. What do you do, right, for places that don't have jobs, that may used to have had jobs, but that don't now?
So as unsympathetic as Kevin is, and Kevin is very acid when it comes to this sort of thing, I don't think he's actually wrong. The difference is that I think that we have current policies in place that really disincentivize you from doing that, from finding a job that, you know, is in another state or that would require you to relocate. Particularly if you are on any of the programs that I mentioned. If you're receiving welfare checks via Ohio, or if you're on the Ohio Medicaid system, if you're currently receiving those types of disability forms, then moving to get a job is going to be something that's going to tear all of that away. And for people who are on the very low end of the income spectrum, that makes it a lot less feasible. There are a lot of different ideas for ways to deal with that. One is to say that if you have proof of new employment somewhere else, that you could get a lump sum of 1 month or something like that from the current program in order to allow you to move in that direction. But I also think that we are living in a time that globalism, the global expansion and advancement of technology works in both directions. In the sense that, yes, you may not have a job here, but there are also jobs you can do now that you couldn't do before because of your ability to work from home, be on a laptop, and basically fulfill a lot of different jobs. One of the things that I actually one of the things that I actually find encouraging is the degree to which I think Americans are coming around to the idea that these jobs aren't going to come back, so we're going to have to find something new. We're at a point of real fraying and of real discouragement among a lot of communities, but I think that's also coming with sort of a realization that we aren't going to go back to the way it was, and that's the simple truth is that we can't. Even if Donald Trump was elected and put all his policies in place, you're not going to roll that back. So I think we need to make it easier for people to move, particularly moving between states and jurisdictions in order to find a new job. I think we also need to really change the way that we educate and offer educational availability to people when it comes to specific courses. Being able to, just as something as simple as being able to allow corporations to accredit down to a specific course of work where they are training you to do a job, where you can agree to do the job for a certain amount of time afterwards when the training is done. We need to rework the way that we think about these types of processes and not just leave these folks who are stuck with high school education, doing a job for a certain amount of time and now feel like they have nowhere to go. We need to find places for them to go, and the answer can't just be more welfare and more redistribution, because that is not going to make them happy. It's not going to make them content, and it really, is just not what they deserve as fellow citizens and Americans. So, thank you so much for saying and asking so many great questions.